Kettlebell Advanced Progressions Workshop presentation 1.5, Squat and Other Exercises and Progressions. So the objectives of this workshop are to show examples of over 100 kettlebell exercise variations and progressions, and to give guidance on the differences between variations and how to apply these exercises practically. The objectives of this presentation are to show examples of the squat variations and progressions, and then other exercises, and to highlight the application of these exercises. So prerequisites. Well, this presentation is aimed at those who have completed a kettlebell instructor certification course. As such, you should be competent in the one-hand kettlebell front squat, the windmill, high windmill, and the Turkish get-up. So squat review. On the biomechanics, the squat is a quad or knee dominant lower body movement pattern. Differs from the other lower body pattern, the lift, in the fact that the squat is knee dominant rather than hip dominant, which would be a lift pattern. This means that there is greater use of the knee extensors, the quadriceps, to produce force, in addition to the hip extensors, the hamstrings and the glutes. So we see the idea with the front squat, particularly more so than the back squats, you want to try and keep a more vertical torso position, as we see in the image there, and maintain the load over the base to support the feet. So the first exercise we'll look at is the kettlebell one-hand front squat. So you hold the kettlebell in the rack position, feet about hip shoulder width apart, flex the knees forward, lower the hips down towards the heels, ideally until you reach maximal knee flexion, and drive back up to the standing position. It's important to try to achieve maximal knee flexion in order to get the dorsiflexion required, and to lower the hips down towards the heels rather than trying to push back. In the bottom position, you want to try to maintain as vertical a torso position as possible, load or kettlebell over the feet, and as you see there, maximal knee flexion with the patellas tracking over the shoelaces or second or third toe. So this is a standard one-hand kettlebell drill. Can be made a little easier by holding it in two hands, usually in a bottoms up position, so the load is more central. Therefore you're going to need a little less lateral core and lateral hip stability because it's reduced frontal plane stress. Variation to this, rather than holding it in the rack position, as you see there, still using one hand, but this time we're using a bottom side up or BSU grip. So you hold the kettlebell upside down. You have to squeeze the handle tightly to hold it in place and to balance it with the forearm vertical. Do your same squat down, or the same teaching points, lowering the hips towards the heels, flexing the knees maximally. The idea is to try to keep the forearm vertical both from the side and looking at it from the front. You have to squeeze the handle tightly using the muscles of the hand in order to maintain the grip. That can be then combined with the bottoms up swing clean, or even a bottoms up press if you want to make it into more of a complex exercise. Split squats with the front foot elevated. This is a drill we use quite a bit as a remedial drill for people that struggle to get a full range of motion on the squat. If you're a little bit tight in dorsiflexion, then mobilizing the foot and ankle in a split stance with the front foot raised can really help you to increase the mobility. So you'd hold the load, in this case the kettlebell, in the opposite hand, in this case the right foot raised, and you're just going to try to dorsiflex as much as possible, push the knee as far forward as you can until the hamstring touches the calf and you're in full knee flexion. Foot is kept flat, heels kept on the step, and it's an active way of mobilizing. Very good for working the VMO of that lead leg and also the glute of the lead leg. Can do this with a dumbbell or a cable machine as well, but in this case just showing the kettlebell version. With the rear foot raised, that tends to mobilize the rear hip flexor, but with the front foot raised, that's great for mobilizing the foot and ankle in dorsiflexion. Now, overhead squats. This is a tough drill. Usually performed with a kettlebell with one hand. Two hand, it's quite difficult to do with both hands above the head. So it's one hand. The feet are usually a little bit wider than the parallel stance front squat. The other hand just goes in between the legs to touch the floor, and again we're looking at trying to get full range of motion, so the hamstrings touch the calves, feet are kept flat on the ground, knees are kept tracking over the shoelaces or second or third toe. And what we tend to see is you get a little bit of rotation, so the torso tends to rotate slightly, Eyes are kept on the kettlebell throughout. Try to keep the palm facing forward as best you can. And the weight, the kettlebell is always kept in between the feet and over the base of support. So a few coaching points for this one. It's going to work the glutes, quads, shoulders and lateral core muscles. Again, particularly as the weight gets heavier and heavier, the lateral core is going to work harder and harder. So you lift the kettlebell above the head, hold with the elbow locked. You want to adopt a slightly wider than normal squat stance. You can have the toes pointed out or rotated out a little bit more than usual. Have the other hand, just place it in between the thighs. And you want to squat down until the other hand ideally kind of touches the floor. Allow the torso to rotate slightly if needed. And you want to watch the kettlebell throughout. Keep your eyes on it, and that stops the bell of the kettlebell from rolling off the forearm, which can damage the shoulder. You then want to stand back up to the start position, pushing through the floor, and then repeat. Now, variation or progression from this would be a double kettlebell, 2 hands anyhow. So what we do here, the 2 hands anyhow, is effectively trying to get 2 heavy weights above your head, so we can clean and press or snatch one weight up, the other kettlebell's in between the feet. We then do an overhead squat pattern down, take hold of the handle, curl it up to the rack position, stand up, and then press it or jerk it above the head. So we're kind of using the inner thigh, place the elbow on the inner thigh, and use that kind of like a concentration curl in order to help lift that weight up, whilst still maintaining the first weight, the first kettlebell, above the head in an overhead squat pattern. So if someone really wants to kind of challenge themselves, they can perform bicep curls, but you should try performing a concentration curl in an overhead squat position. It's a challenging drill. The 2 hands anyhow, it's an old school vintage exercise. Initially it was done with 2 different implements. So again, if you want to lift the barbell above your head and then hold the barbell and then squat down to pick up the kettlebell is always used as a secondary object because the handle was slightly higher off the ground than like a dumbbell. It was always easier to lift the equivalent weight because it was already a little bit higher off the ground. So another vintage drill is a vintage squat. Different type of squat. It's almost like a kind of plie squat. You have your feet pointed out about 45 degrees, come up onto your toes, and then you go into, again, deep knee flexion. You're trying to keep your torso as vertical as possible. In this case, we're holding the kettlebell with 2 hands, bottom side up grip. So come up onto the toes, lower ourselves down, and then to initiate the ascent, you then press the heels into the ground, as we see there, boom, and then come back up. Again, very good drill for working the VMO, which is quite heavily recruited in full knee flexion, and also for mobilizing the foot and ankle if dorsiflexion is a little bit restricted. So the coaching points for this one, it's going to work the gluteals and quadricep muscles predominantly. So hold the kettlebell on a bottom side up grip with 2 hands on the horns and the bell on the chest or just in front of the chest. Stand with the heels together, feet rotated out about 45 degrees, and you come up onto your toes, and then keeping the torso vertical, you want to squat down to maximum knee flexion. Pause briefly at the bottom, and then push the heels down into the floor in order to stand up and repeat. Variations of the front squat, doing the same drill, this time with our heels elevated. And again, this can be a very good one if people are a little bit tight, to help them achieve full knee flexion and recruit the VMO muscles. As you can see here, keeping the torso almost perfectly vertical, knees are coming forward, which is fine, but this just accommodates kind of slightly kind of tighter foot or ankle, which you will see in some people. Good exercise variation. If you use it because you are incredibly tight in dorsiflexion and restricted, you don't really want to use the drill just to get around the fact that you're restricted. It's good as an exercise variation, but if you are a little bit tight around the foot and ankle and can't get into a full range of motion front squat, then you'd want to address those immobility issues with stretching, self-myofascial release and other techniques. Next drill variation we look at is kind of what we call Cossack squats, or sometimes referred to as Cossack lunges. More of a Cossack squat because you don't actually lunge down to one side, but it's a wide stance. We then squat down onto one leg, keeping the other leg straight. You lift the toes up, pivot on that heel, and you're trying to get down into a deep kind of lateral squat position. Hold the kettlebell with 2 hands. Very good one for working the medial hamstrings and adductors. And again, you should be able to get into deep knee flexions. It's going to be good for the quads, the VMO, and the glutes. Could also do that with a single kettlebell in a rack position, or 2 kettlebells in a double rack position. Next drill we're looking at is we'll call it tactical lunge. This is the alternating forwards lunge, and what we do is we're actually kind of changing hands with each one. So if you're holding it in the left hand here, you'd lunge with the right, and then as you lunge forward, you swing the kettlebell underneath the leg and swapped hands. So you look at it from the front. A little bit wonky on that rep. It's a little bit of hand-to-hand coordination alongside performing a standard front lunge or forward lunge exercise. Now the split knee or leg drive, again it's a knee dominant action, so it comes under the squat pattern, and it looks a little bit like a reverse lunge. The main difference is we're actually starting from a split kneeling position. This knee is actually deliberately placed on the ground. You need it to be quite close to that the front heel. All the weight is on the front leg, and then from this dead start we drive up and then lift the rear leg up with a knee drive, so the knee comes up to about hip level. All the stress then is going to be on that left leg, the lead leg, the quads and the glutes particularly. You want to make sure you don't have too wide a stance, otherwise it's very difficult to shift the weight forward and come onto that front leg. Again, this is done in a rack position, can be done with a kettlebell held overhead, or 2 kettlebells in a double rack position. One of our other favourite squat pattern exercises is the reverse crossover lunge or reverse crossover step. In this case we're holding the kettlebell in one hand and squatting down or lunging down. It's referred to as either reverse crossover lunge or reverse crossover squat on the opposite leg. So you take a step back and across and lower the kettlebell down towards the medial arch of that stance or squatting leg. Keep the hips facing forward, and it's very good then for activating the hip abductors on the outside part of the thigh, as well as the quads and the glutes, which are going to get worked as well. Now we hold it in the opposite hand because this effectively helps to increase the stress and the load placed upon those abductors. If we were to hold it in this case in the left hand, the same leg that's going to be squatting down, you don't get as much overload. The fact that it's held in the opposite hand kind of pulls the body more laterally, provides a greater frontal plane stress, which helps to increase the overload on those left leg hip abductors. An alternative to this is holding it in a rack position, and again we would hold it in the opposite hand and the rack on that side rather than on the same side. You hold it on the left side, it's not really going to work as well. On the right side, like we see here, that really helps to drive and pull that part of the body down, thereby increasing the stress on the left leg abductors. Still going to be working, as you said, the quadriceps. It's very important the hips are kept facing forward in order to correctly overload these abductors. If you allow the hips to twist round, it really takes the stress off the muscles that you're trying to activate. Should be nice and dynamic. Otherwise the muscle spindle activation isn't going to be as great at a slower velocity. Last one we'll look at on the squat variations, what we call an alternating front squat. So you actually kind of hold the handle with 2 hands. It's in a rack position on one side, and then what you do is as you come up, as we see here, we flick the kettlebell over, catch it in the rack position on the other side, drop down and repeat. So on the ascent you use that force and that momentum to help flick the kettlebell overhead. Good for kind of sports where you have to get used to a little bit of kind of contact, like rugby and martial arts and things like that, and just nice little kind of variation from a standard front squat where you keep it on the same side throughout. So other exercises, progressions and variations that we'll look at will be progressions and variations of the Turkish get-up, the windmill, different rows and curls, and then any other exercises that haven't been covered in the other presentations, such as the plank rotator cuff stabilizers, kneeling to standing drills, and the step and reach. So first one let's have a quick review of is Turkish get up. So this is moving a load from a supine position to a standing position. Take the kettlebell in one hand, come up into a seated position, swing the leg back, come up into a split kneel position, and then push up into standing. Arm is kept locked throughout, eyes are on the kettlebell throughout. Go back down, swing the leg through, and down, back onto the back, and that's our single repetition. Very good for improving shoulder stability, hip stability and mobility, proprioception, and core stability. Previously this was done with a barbell. Commonly you see a lot of people do it with kettlebell nowadays. It's a very good preparation style drill that a lot of people should use before they start trying to lift heavy weights above their head. It's quite a complex thing when you go through all the full movement. The half get up can be a nice way to get started, where you're just really kind of focusing on the core a little bit more, a little less on the kind of hip side, and you're doing this first phase where you come up onto the forearm and then up onto the hand and into this kind of supported seated position. And we can do multiple reps of that, so even if you're doing 15-20 reps of that, it's much easier because the time under tension is much less than if you're trying to do the full Turkish get up. As we tend to say, come up onto the forearm or the elbow and then drive up onto the hand, and then we're in the right position in which to do the next phase. But it's a good starting drill to kind of teach somebody the first few phases. Down onto the forearm or the elbow and then back onto your back. You see, elbows kept locked throughout, eyes are on the kettlebell throughout. Now, variation to the standard kind of split stance Turkish get up, which is what we just saw, is to do more of a kind of squat style variation. The starting point is the same up until here, and then from here you actually place both feet together, shift your weight forward so the kettlebell's over the feet, and then from there drive up from a deep overhead squat position. Then back down into overhead squat, shift your hand back, leg goes forward and down onto the back. So it's doing it in a parallel stance rather than the split stance, kind of split kneeling stance that we saw a second ago. From here is the critical part. You have to shift your weight forward so the kettlebell gets over the feet so you can drive up from that position. Prerequisite of this one, then, you need to be able to perform an overhead squat as we saw one of the previous exercises, otherwise it's going to be pretty much impossible to do this variation. So it's going to work the anterior and lateral core, deltoids, rotator cuff, triceps, and obviously the leg muscles as well. So start in a supine position, kettlebell held in one arm, pointing upwards, push up onto the supporting hand and then come up into a supported seated position. Plant both feet flat on the ground, shift your weight forward using your supporting hand, and then drive up to a standing position from this overhead squat position, keeping the arm locked. Then reverse the sequence, back down, and repeat. Other variations of the kind of moving and carrying loads. This one, just a get up anyhow. You can do this from a supine or a seated position. It's actually holding the kettlebell with two hands, in this case bottom up position, and it's just getting up and down from the floor without using your hands. You can use any technique you want. Try to alternate which hand you kind of lead from, and from here, just getting used to it. It's actually a very good hip mobilizing drill to both mobilize and work some of the hip stabilizers. Good for some sports where you have to get up off the floor without the use of your hands. So for example, if you're a martial arts fighter trying to hold the guy off and trying to move from a weaker position, being on your back or in a seated position, to a more stronger position on your feet, then this is quite a nice drill to kind of train for that. Other drills then have our kneeling to standing, and this can be done in a rack with single kettlebells we see here. It's just coming up to standing and then back down. Again, we could progress this up into a full seated position or even supine if you want to. Single kettlebell in two hands, single kettlebell in rack, double kettlebells in double rack. Or as we see with the next drill, you could add kind of other drills to it. So we go kneeling to standing, and then we add a push press to it. And this is what we see here, same drill as before, up into a standing position, and then we do a little dip and drive to push the kettlebell above the head. Again, variations to this, we could do 2 kettlebells, either push press both of them above the head, or you could hold one in rack, push press the other, bring it back down, and then just alternate arms with each repetition. Surprisingly how tough, particularly with a kind of heavier load, just getting up from a kneeling to standing position actually is. And it is very good for calorific expenditure if you're looking at weight loss and those types of things. Next drill then, fantastic preparation drills, the kettlebell high windmill. The standard technique that we tend to prescribe is the other hand on the inner thigh. The key things with this, the rear leg is kept straight, eyes are kept on the kettlebell throughout. Try to keep the palm holding the kettlebell facing forward, arms locked, and you want to lower yourself down, ideally until that reaching lead hand touches the ground. The rear hip should be over the rear foot, rear leg straight. As you can see, I do it with the both feet pointing internally rotated, with the front leg slightly bent. It's an amazing preparation drill to improve shoulder and scapular stability, lateral core mobility and stability, and to mobilize the rear hip and the lateral myofascial line. Again, alongside the Turkish get up, one of the standard drills that was taught to beginners before they're allowed to lift heavy weights above the head. Variations of that, one of the nice ones we like to do is a hand behind the back. So you put the arm into like a internally rotated position, hands kind of in between the shoulder blades, and you do the same drill, but even just without that little bit of additional support of that lead hand on the inner thigh does make it a little bit more challenging. Body position is still the same. We're trying to get into almost a horizontal torso position. Try to avoid any excessive forward lean, try to keep it as much as you can in the frontal plane. But key things, arms locked, palms facing forward, eyes are on the kettlebell. Those are the main things you want to focus on. So it's going to work the deltoids, obliques, triceps and trapezius muscles. I'm going to hold the kettlebell overhead with the elbow locked, place the lead hand behind the back between the shoulder blades, and lower the torso down to the side. You want to keep the rear leg straight and the hip over the rear ankle. Keep the elbow locked and watch the kettlebell throughout. You want to push the hips underneath the torso to help return you to kind of vertical. Push upwards with a straight arm through the kettlebell throughout the exercise. So the next drill is a double kettlebell drill, alternating between a high-low windmill. So we have one kettlebell in each hand. One hand is in the low position, one in the high position. We then swap them over, windmill to the other side, swap them over in the rack position, boom boom, windmill down to the other side. It's a tough drill because you're kind of lifting the kettlebell without the kind of use of a kind of swing clean to get into the rack position, pressing overhead. But it is quite nice. A lot of people kind of prefer it than doing the whole set with the arm up, because they may get some local muscular fatigue, which they find is a little bit limiting for them. Next exercise is what we call reverse step and reach. Very good for overloading the hamstrings and glutes and erector spinae on one leg. So it's kind of like the lift equivalent of a reverse lunge. Take a step back, perform this kind of split stance Romanian deadlift, lowering the kettlebell towards the floor to the inside of the foot, and then driving back up. The quicker it's done, the more you're going to overload the muscle spindles. Key tactical points: you want to keep that shin, front shin vertical as you step back. Chest is up so the back doesn't round. And ideally done it in a nice fluid quick movement will help, as we said, with the muscle spindle activation. This is going to work the hamstrings, glutes and posterior core muscles. Hold the kettlebell with both hands just on the front of the hips. With all the weight on one leg, take a small step backwards with the other leg. Bend forwards from the hips, not the spine, and reach downwards towards the floor. You want to keep the torso neutral, lead shin vertical. Then drive back up and step forwards with the rear leg in one smooth movement, and repeat on both legs. Different from a standard step of reach, which is the equivalent of like a forward lunge. You take a step forward and then get into that same split stance Romanian deadlift position. With here the step is a step backwards. Next drill is what we call up and overs, two hand. You hold it with the horns, drop the kettlebell down in between the legs, and then you're going to lift it up and over the head. Use the anterior core and the shoulders and arms to decelerate the load. Flick it back over the head, drop it back down between the legs, and repeat. So semi-continuous drill. So you lift it up, decelerate it using the anterior core, flip it back over, drop it straight down between the legs, kind of like a hang clean position. And repeat. You want to make sure that the weight isn't too heavy that you won't be able to decelerate it using your anterior core, so that's the kind of main limiting factor that we find with this drill. Figure of 8. It's a great little hand-to-hand proprioception drill. Effectively swing the kettlebell between the legs, swapping the hands over as we swing in between the legs. May get a little bit of lateral shift from leg to leg as you kind of do it. So kettlebell swings forward, goes back in between the legs, we swap hands there, then comes round the outside leg, swings back in between the middle, and repeats. Nice little warm-up drill or basic drill to kind of get people started, and also with some of the kind of juggling stuff, get people used to shifting the kettlebell from one hand to the other and get them a little bit more confident with hand-to-hand coordination. Little variation progression of this is to do a figure of 8 and then once around the back. So we do, see, round our back, figure of 8, once around the back to swap hands, and repeat. So hand swap again, swing in between the legs, hand swap again, between the legs, hand swap, and repeat. Halos, great little drill to kind of mobilize and improve shoulder stability, effectively rolling the kettlebell around the head without it touching. Elbow goes nice and high as you roll it. You want to repeat in both directions as well. Again, this is commonly used as a kind of warm-up and mobilizing drill for a lot of people before they get started with the main part of their kettlebell session, but a very good one for mobilizing tight shoulders and tight thoracic spine. Hold the kettlebell by the horns, and as we said, rolling it around. Quite good for the grip as well, but mainly we use it for shoulder mobility. Next drill, renegade rows. We can do this a couple of ways. So the first way, this is using some kind of pull-up bars. Hand goes onto those, kettlebells to the side, and effectively it's rows in a kind of plank position. So tough on the kind of anterior core as well as the kind of pulling muscles. The variation of this is still going to do one hand rows, but this time the other hand is on another kettlebell. This is harder because the left hand was on the blue kettlebell, so it's a little bit more unstable than the previous bars. This is critical. You really only want to do this with competition kettlebells because they have a much wider base. It means they're going to be much more stable. If you do these with any other type of kettlebells, you may well find that because they have a much smaller base, they may well slip over, which could cause wrist, elbow or shoulder injuries, or even you could hit your face on the kettlebell on the way down. So it's much safer to kind of do it with competition kettlebells because they're at the thick base, they're a little bit more designed for this type of thing. You could also do alternating rows. So in this case you'd do it with two kettlebells the same size. We'd row on one side, place that one down, and then row on the other hand and alternate with each repetition. Other drill performed in a pretty similar position, in this kind of prone plank position. This time we're going to pop the kettlebells on this side so the handles are facing you. Hands go onto the bell section and the fingers on the base, and what we do is we hold a plank position, but we're actually a little bit more dynamic. We're actually going to roll the kettlebells from side to side. It's a very good drill to kind of challenge the rotator cuff muscles. Here we see a little bit of a kind of close-up. Range of motion doesn't need to be huge, but it's going to be a nice drill progression from a standard plank in order to kind of work the rotator cuff a little bit harder. Still going to be working the anterior core as well as the shoulder and triceps, but it's the scapular stabilizers and rotator cuff muscles we're really trying to focus on with this one. So you place two competition kettlebells on this side, handles on the side near to you, Adopt a prone plank position with the hands on the bell section, kind of fingers on the base. Hold the position with a braced core, and then you want to roll the bell section slowly from side to side in order to challenge the rotator cuff. Keep the range of motion small, try not to go too far with it, and you do that for a time under tension, anything from kind of 30 to 60 seconds. Next drill, look at overhead walks. A few variations with this. Walking with a load overhead is a great way of kind of challenging both the triceps, deltoids, but particularly the thoracic stabilizers and the rotator cuff. The heavier the load as well, it's going to be a little bit on the lateral core and lateral hip. Can walk forwards and back, or we can do a figure of 8 as we just saw there. Double overhead walks. So what we do here is you could overhead squat or windmill, second kettlebell above your head, and then we'll hold 2 kettlebells above the head. Can be the same weight, can be different weights for a bit of an uneven load. In this case we're not doing a figure of 8, we're just going to do a straight walk. So then the 80-degree turn, a little bit unstable, and then again walk back. We'll try and keep the elbows locked. Heavier the weight gets as well, the more its ankle and hip stability will be challenged. We can then overhead squat or windmill back down to the ground. Again, overhead walks, if you've got the space to do it, it's a great kind of drill to kind of challenge it. Kettlebells are a little bit better than, or a little bit different from a barbell. It requires a little less space. You're less likely to bang into a wall or someone else as you're performing the drill then. Seated rotation, quite a standard drill, so great drill for kind of working the rotation movement pattern then. A couple of little variations from this. We can hold it by the horns with the kettlebell normal side up. So this kind of allows us to touch the kettlebell, the base of the kettlebell, on the floor with each repetition. Chest is up. Or we can do it holding it bottom side up, usually not touching the floor, just kind of going to the outside of the hip. These can also be done in like a kneeling or split kneeling position, and we focus more so on coming up and over rather than just rotating the weight forward. Other variations, we have a split kneeling high row. So it's kind of like a partial bent over row, so more of a high row position. It's a supported position, so the other arm is just resting on the thigh. This helps to de-stress the load that's placed on the low back, so you can focus just on the kind of pulling muscles. So shoulder, upper back, biceps, mainly the ones going to get worked. And just get you used to performing a high row position in a slightly different stance, in this case a split kneeling position. You can also use the split kneeling position for this final drill, which is like a concentration curl, kind of like we saw earlier, but this time it's a grip emphasis. So what we do here is you actually kind of have it in a semi-supinated grip. So this 8 kilo kettlebell is much heavier because the load is further away from the pivot point of the elbow than if we were holding a 8 kilo dumbbell. So there's a lot of kind of ulnar radial deviation stress here, so you do have to grip it quite hard, and from a wrist stability aspect as well, it does make it quite challenging. If you find that the range of motion is a bit limited because of the length of your arm and the kettlebell, then you could put your foot up on a step, and that would allow you the full range of motion, or you could do the same kind of thing with the foot up on a bench, and again that would do the same thing, allow you a full range of motion for that drill. But if you're looking at trying to improve the grip, which is quite a weak area, and the wrist stability, which is quite a weak area in a lot of people, then this is a drill that can be used alongside farmers walks and a variety of others to help improve grip and wrist stability. So to review, the objective of this presentation was to show examples of squat variations and progressions, as well as other exercises, and to highlight some of the application of these exercises. You should now perform the guided learning hours, which is 1 hour's practice for these exercises. And you should take yourself through the exercises and then practice teaching the exercises to a colleague, so you can practice explaining and coaching. You should then log the guided learning hours, which is 1.5 hours observation and practice, and the date for your online workshop submission.